Hi, my name is Shamim Sarif. I'm a writer and filmmaker, and we are here today with my wife, Hanan Kattan, who is Palestinian. And we thought we would just do a quick Q&A. Might not be that quick, I don't know, but it's a Q&A to discuss in light of world events. We've had a lot of friends, acquaintances, family who've been asking, particularly Hanan, a lot of questions about history, about what's gone on in the region up till now, what her thoughts are about the way forward. And we just thought it might be nice to put that into a little Q&A format between us. And so without further ado, I'm gonna kick off, and I'm going to say, Hanan, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you give us a little bit of your background, please? Your Palestinian heritage, who you are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm an entrepreneur and also a film producer. And the stories we focus on that you write, Shamim, and direct are focused on female protagonists, women of color, diversity, LGBTQ, focusing on humanism and inclusion. And from the 5 films we've done, 3 have Palestinian characters of everyday Palestinian lives, people in diaspora, because we feel stories matter and representation matters. And I'm
Yeah.
not a historian or a politician, so just to
Just before a disclaimer before we go into this. So
right,
yes, that is a bit about us, and we agree obviously on that representation matters, because we've often seen Palestinians, particularly on film, as the dispossessed, or worse, as terrorists. So that tends to be the prevailing narrative. But tell us a little bit about your family history as a Palestinian. Where is your family from?
Yeah, so my dad's from Bethlehem and my mom is from Jerusalem. She was born in Haifa, where they had a home, and I was brought up as a Christian Palestinian. I was born in Jordan because after the war they met there, and yeah, so I was brought up as a Christian
Post
Palestinian.
1948, yeah. So just going back to the whole Christian Palestinian thing, I have to admit that when we met, and that this is going back nearly 30 years, I didn't realize there were Christian Arabs in the Middle East or Christian Palestinians. Can you just tell us a little bit about that community, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was surprised by how few people know about it. I mean, there aren't exact numbers, but there are over 1 million Palestinian Christians in the diaspora and in Palestine. And for centuries, really, Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in Palestine. They thrived, they coexisted. They lived from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or at the time it was Transjordan, Iraq, North Africa, Iran, and across the Middle East and Turkey, of course.
So at that time, there was a mixture of Jews and Christians and Muslims in the Arab world.
Exactly. And the Christian Palestinians, they have a strong voice as well. You know, you have people, historians from Edward Said to, I can talk about my own family, like Victor Kattan, my cousin, who's a professor, a lawyer. He's written books on Palestine and writes a lot. Fadi Kattan, the chef and restaurateur, and he has a book coming out on Bethlehem. Karim Kattan also has written a novel on Palestine. And on my mother's side, there's Samia Halabi, the artist, whose work is in the Guggenheim. So there always been, and that's just my family, and there are many other Christian Palestinians who've been very active in the community and contributing.
Yeah, and certainly for us in our world, we have a big diversity of friends, including a lot of Jewish friends, from all over, but some from the Middle East as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. From North America, Canada, from the Middle East. I mean, for example, my roommate from boarding school, we're talking over 50 years ago, is Turkish Jewish. She's one of my very dear friends. So yeah, very, very diverse friends who are Jewish. Yeah.
Yeah, and going back to the link to the Middle East, there are active, thriving Jewish communities in places like Turkey and even Iran today.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there are active synagogues, Hebrew schools. Even in Iran, there are 5 seats reserved to minorities, including in the Iranian parliament, including one for Jewish MPs, for Christians who are either Armenian, Assyrian, and Zoroastrian. So it's quite yeah, it's definitely diverse.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, going back to your family in Palestine as well, I remember you telling me your grandfather's stories of having Jewish friends, Muslim friends. And I've heard this, of course, from certain other Palestinian friends of ours too. So there was this element of coexistence way back. How did that change, or how has that changed over time? Can you give us a bit of history and context, knowing that you're not a historian?
Yeah, no. So I mean, the when the Zionist movement started, more and more Jewish people were encouraged to go to Palestine and to buy land and or to become a bigger percentage of the population. So that kind of started with Zionism as a movement that came. And but I think a lot of people don't understand that, Judaism and the Jewish identity are very different from the Zionist movement, which is a political movement and started in the 19th century by European Jews to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. So really, it wasn't people from the land, it was people who wanted to come and take over the land. And in 1917, the Balfour Declaration was signed, where the British made a pledge to Rothschild and the Zionists to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. So they sort of promised a country that did not belong to them to the Zionists. And then at the same time, they wanted to defeat the Ottoman Turks, who were occupying the area in World War II. So the British needed the support of the Arabs and promised them independence if they supported the revolt against the Ottomans. So yeah, I don't know. I'm sure everyone's seen Lawrence of Arabia and that
Yeah,
kind of whole.
which
Yeah.
is what World War One. I think you said World War Two, but you mean
Sorry, World War One.
yeah. So, but so at that time, so basically, the British were promising the Jewish people, the Rothschild family, the Zionist movement, a homeland, but they were also promising the Arabs a homeland and independence. So they were were they playing both sides? Is that fair to
Absolutely, absolutely. So,
say?
so the British were unfortunately playing both sides, and also when the British and the French divided the area under the Sykes-Picot Agreement as well, um, after winning the war, the First War, and then the British made Palestine into a mandate from 1922 to 1948, where they ruled Palestine as a mandate.
So the British were in charge at that point,
Yes.
Palestine.
Yeah.
Okay. And then so the I think one of the myths that I keep hearing is that Israel was established on land where there was nobody. It was virgin territory, and I think it's we can understand why that suits people to want to believe, but in fact, it was established on land where there was quite a large existing population. Can you tell us a little bit about that population, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's very important for people to understand that in terms of the history and the context, because the majority of the population in Palestine were Palestinian Muslims and Christians, with a very small Jewish minority. And it increased gradually as per the Zionist plan. So they started buying more and more lands, encouraging immigration to Palestine. And to give you an idea, in 1948, the Jewish people owned only 7% of Palestine, and the population had increased to 30% of the population, and mostly because of World War II. And just leading to that, there was a much bigger immigration push to Palestine. But then, despite the Jewish people in Palestine owning a very small percentage of the land, and despite being the minority in Palestine, the United Nations General Assembly voted to divide Palestine just haphazardly, if you like, in 1947, and to give away the indigenous Palestinian land that belonged to the Palestinians, to split it and to give 56% of Palestine, including the best agricultural land, to the Jewish people, even though they were a much smaller minority. And then they decided to give 42% of Palestine to the indigenous, to keep it with the indigenous Palestinian people, even though they owned at the time 93% of the land. So they said, here, you just take 42% of the land. And then the remaining 2% was to be international zone, like Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and all in between. So yeah, that's how the UN decided to split up Palestine, historic Palestine.
Yeah. So the UN has a charter that talks about principles of national self-determination. We've been hearing something about that, but doesn't that sort of wholesale, well, take 50% of the land, sort of contravene the right for people to decide their own destiny, which is the point of that UN charter?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And then, when that decision was made, of course, the Palestinians and the Arab countries rejected the proposal to divide the country, to divide historic Palestine, because Jewish people were always welcomed and lived there. They came, they bought land, they coexisted. I have stories from my grandfather with Jewish friends and relatives, and let's say, sorry, not relatives, Jewish friends and Jewish neighbors, and that's a story you hear it from many other Palestinians. But really, the Palestinians didn't want to be forced to leave their ancestral homes and their land. And so, as a result of that, when the British pulled out, war broke out.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the movement of Palestinians, from what I know as well, again, not a historian, was very much driven by fear. And I was surprised to learn that Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, well-known, well-respected prime ministers of Israel, were in their day leaders of the Irgun and the Stern Gang officially. Now, these two groups, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, were officially labeled as terrorist groups by the British government, much as as they were official terrorist groups. So I was surprised that these two, who then went on to become leaders of Israel, were leaders of these two groups. Tell us a little bit about the Stern Gang and the Irgun, because they did commit well-documented atrocities against the Palestinians.
They definitely did. And I think it was part of the sort of Zionist plan to ethnically cleanse Palestinians and to move them out of their homes. There are many methods, and some of them were well documented massacres and atrocities to push the Palestinians out of their home. And it started before Israel was established, and it increased as the British left. So it was all about killing civilians, pushing them out. I'll give you one example. In 1948, in April, the Deir Yassin massacre, again, a very well documented massacre. They killed over 100 Palestinian villagers, including women and children, and many other such things. And they went from village to village, terrorizing and scaring the people. So it wasn't at all. History was rewritten to say actually the Palestinians left waiting for the Arab armies to come and save them, but actually they were forcibly expelled and terrorized into leaving their homes. And then the IDF absorbed the Irgun and other such terrorist organizations at the time. And even Albert Einstein in the New York Times in 1948 described the Irgun as a terrorist right-wing chauvinist organization. So it was quite well documented for those who want to look it up.
Yeah, yeah, and again, it's important to just have that narrative there, because often, like in the movie Israelism, the young American Jews, and there were certain Israeli Jews as well there, who were talking about the fact that they had been taught a very different narrative, that the land was completely empty waiting for them. So I think it is important to know, because it just is sort of important history.
Yeah.
But let's go back to 1948 and to what Palestinians call the Nakba, and to the foundation of Israel, with the support of the US and, of course, most Western countries. And we talked about these massacres and terror driving Palestinians out of their homes. But it wasn't just, I mean, there were about 530 odd villages that were completely destroyed. Is that correct?
Right. That's right. Yes, it was definitely terror, violence. Look, people get worried for their lives. They just want to safeguard their families. And we're seeing it now in Gaza, but basically the sort of the terror and the war and the atrocities drove over 750,000, almost 750,000 indigenous Palestinian people from their homes and their land. And they became refugees in other countries, including the West Bank, including Gaza. They were never allowed to return back to their homes, to their ancestral land, and to their country. And we refer to it as Al-Nakba, which is the catastrophe, Al-Nakba. And so 85% of the total Palestinian population were ethnically cleansed of the land that the Israelis captured in 1948 from historic Palestine. That's 85% of the population. And that's not of all of Palestine, just the lands that were captured. So really, I mean, Israel was and still is fully supported by Western powers. They won the war, and they end up taking 78% of Palestinian land, even though the UN gave them under the charter 56%, but they took 78%, and as a result, we had the ethnically cleansing of a vast number of Palestinians as a result.
So they didn't stick to the UN land. They've gone over that.
Yeah, yeah.
In
Exactly.
contravention of international law. So let's talk about your mom and her family, because they were caught up in the Nakba of 1948. What happened to them?
Yes, absolutely. So my mom and her brothers and parents couldn't go back. They're from Jerusalem, so they lost their home in Jerusalem, their building in Haifa, their business, without a penny of restitution and no right of return, like many, many other Palestinians. So it was a big shock. It was quite traumatic. And it's rarely talked about in the West. The Nakba has been rewritten to kind of disappear from Western consciousness or history, unfortunately, except for the Arab history. And so, for example, my uncles, my mother's younger brothers, years later, located their home in West Jerusalem. And they knocked at the door, and they were greeted by older German Jewish couple who confirmed, yes, they moved in after my mom's family had to leave, and that they only decorated maybe the bathroom, modernized it, and the kitchen, but everything else stayed the same. So it was very traumatic for them. They cried, they were very upset, and yeah, it's just not a nice thing to go through. But of course, they couldn't go back or take anything.
Well, why aren't these stories told in mainstream media? It seems to, as you say, be very much glossed over.
I mean, I think many reasons, but really, look, Israel is a settler colonial state, and it has colonized historic Palestine, and it suits Western governments and to support Israel and to have a destabilizing power in the Middle East. And and I think the press, the media, and so on are very much aligned with that policy, unfortunately. So
But
people probably.
even with that policy, it's like, but why can we not talk about the suffering of the Palestinians or be pro-Palestinian? I mean, there's always this sort of pushback that it's somehow anti-Semitic, which I
Yes.
really disagree with.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Because anytime anyone's being pro-Palestinian, it doesn't mean that they're being anti-Semitic. They're two different things. One is about human rights. So I think the Western press and media and politicians have sort of silenced people by labeling, including Jewish organizations, by labeling people who are advocating for Palestinian human rights as anti-Zionist, and nobody wants to be called anti-Semitic, and nobody wants to be called that. So, but I think things are changing now with the war on Gaza now, and Gaza, as we say, and thanks to social media, I think more and more people, especially young people, are seeing firsthand the atrocities that are being committed daily. So
Yeah.
the history that was rewritten in 48 and 67 now is like live history where people on their smart devices are seeing and questioning and looking back and trying to see what really happened and what led us to this. Because I think there's a lot of context missing. People
Yes,
don't understand the
that's partly
history.
why we felt we should have this conversation, because of that.
Exactly.
It was surprising just how many people, felt like none of that existed.
Mm.
But I just wanted to go back to the anti-Semitic thing and just to make a big distinction, because I think it's very important to root out anti-Semitism wherever it exists, because anti-Jewish sentiment for the sake of it is absolutely appalling in the way that anti-Muslim, anti-anything, for its own sake. So I think, but we're drawing a very clear distinction between that and because we're very respectful and admiring of many of the Jewish community and Israelis who are speaking out, but they're also coming under pressure and being called anti-Semitic by their own country and their own people often because they're critiquing Israel's current policies. But that's a very different thing, I believe.
Absolutely, 100%. I agree with you. Yeah.
Sorry, but back to Israel. It's a Jewish state. We of course formed that way, and we know that there are a large minority of non-Jews living in Israel. Let's talk about them, please.
Yeah, so well, if we look at so 1948 we covered briefly, and then there was a 1967 Six-Day War where Israel took over the rest of the Palestinian territory. So they took over the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And right now there are around 5 million Palestinians living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And that's where a big problem has happened. Now, besides historic Israel, we'll talk about that. You have now settlements and settlers living on illegally living on Palestinian land in the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So
But within Israel, when Israel was established in the 1948 war, who are the non-Jews who are living in Israel at this stage?
yes, so yeah, absolutely. So a small minority of Palestinians did remain in after the war in 48, and now they are around 2 million Palestinians, Muslim and Christian, around 21% of the Israeli population, and who became Israeli citizens. And I think a lot of people don't know that. But they remained under Israeli military law till 1966, even though they were Israeli citizens. And Israel refers to them as Israeli Arabs, which is, I think, on purpose to remove any reference to being Palestinian or Palestine. So they wanted to create this Israeli Arab concept.
Yeah.
So in total, there are 7 million Palestinians, 2 million living in Israel, and the rest in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So that 5 million is living under Israeli occupation.
Okay. Let's go to Gaza, which is dominating obviously the news right now. Can you give us some background about who are the Palestinians in Gaza? Because everybody thinks they're from Gaza, but they're actually not, a lot of them.
Yeah, exactly. They're not. So around 1.7 million of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza are refugees already twice over. So they're refugees from the 1948 war, when they lost their homes, and again 1967 war. And for the last 17 years, Gaza has been under siege. So yeah, so now we're seeing the 2.3 million Gazans, if you like, or Palestinians from Gaza being displaced and moved again to many places.
You just said they're under siege. One of the questions that we've had is how is there a siege? Gaza has elections, it has its sort of government, things. It's sort of a little world of its own. How is there a siege?
Yeah, I mean, because
We're not talking about now during the war, just in general.
just
Sorry.
in general, yeah. So there's been a blockade by Israel. So you can't go in and out of Gaza by sea, by air, and by land. There are a few crossings, mainly controlled by Israel, one by Egypt, and they all require, even the Egyptian one, they require permits from Israel. So even the fishermen from Gaza, where they get a lot of the food sources, they're told how far they can go, and oftentimes their seas are attacked, their boats are attacked or seized, and they can't really fish freely as much as they'd like to, or as far out as they'd like to. So
Yeah.
it's a complete blockade, yeah.
Yeah, so you're restricted from going in and out, and we've just seen with Israel's invasion in Gaza, when it wants to, it can stop food.
Yes.
Literally population starving to death now. Water, internet, cell phone reception, everything can just be turned off on a
Yeah, no,
dime.
absolutely. And that's why a lot of people refer to Gaza as the world's largest open air prison. And actually, many historians refer to it as the largest concentration camp. So, which is, I know some people don't like to hear that, but it's been referred to as both.
Well, it's a horrible thing to say, but it's actually that concentration camp quote is from Giora Island. I'm not sure about the pronunciation of
Milan, I think.
the name Island. In March 2004, he was Israel's head of national security, and he called Gaza a huge concentration camp.
Yeah.
So what about the natural gas field that's off the coast of Gaza, which is Palestinian territory?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so many people, sorry, not many people know about the Gaza natural oil. So the Palestinian Authority gave the British Gas Group an exploration license in 99, and they found the Gaza Marine. It's known as the Gaza Marine. So in 2000, so more than 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas has been found outside of Gaza, on the coast of Gaza. And the Gaza Marine field is under a legal jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. But unfortunately, the Israeli forces have prevented the Palestinians from having physical access to their own resources. And Israel is now discussing using that gas themselves and exploring it.
Yeah, I think within a few weeks of the war in Gaza, Biden sent his energy security advisor over to Israel to discuss that natural gas. So to me, there are shades of, Gulf War, the non-existent weapons of mass destruction in order to secure um, secure resources. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but it's certainly a possibility that I think the Western media should be considering a little more strongly. But let's talk about protest, because we have another question from friends. Why don't Palestinians protest peacefully? In fact, there have been constant peaceful protests, many big ones, including a huge one in Gaza in 2018.
That's right. That's right. I mean, everyone knows about the Nakba, the first Nakba, second Nakba, and so on. But in 2018, there was something known as the Great March of Return, and where the Palestinians in Gaza were calling for an Israeli termination of the Israeli blockade, because it was quite yeah, their whole lives were being controlled by that, and they're asking for the right to return to their homes and to their lands. But instead, the Israeli forces responded with brutal force. They killed 214 people, including 46 children. They injured around 36,000, including 8,000 children. And 1 in 5, or over 8,000 people, were hit by live ammunition. In that,
And that was a peaceful protest?
that was a peaceful protest.
According
Yes,
to
well, it started off being a peaceful protest.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But these violations and killings are documented by
Yes, they're very well documented, from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, UN organizations, and even many Israeli human rights organizations. They've documented as
them, I
well.
think is a good one
The
for
Land,
that.
for example. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So so if Israel is occupying land that it wasn't even given to it, and it can terrorize people who protest against that, certainly the UN has tried to sanction Israel on occasion, but the US tends to veto that. But only Palestinian resistance is argued against internationally. But do Palestinians have a right to resist under international law?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Palestinians have a recognized right under international law to resist the Israeli occupation, and it's under Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions. And the United Nations General Assembly has expressly affirmed and confirmed the right of Palestinians to resist the Israeli military occupation. This is recognized by the international community and by the UN as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about the two-state solution, because the US and Israel has talked about this nonstop for decades as the way forward. But why does it seem to you and to a lot of people now is just talk?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think if Israel wanted a two-state solution, would have had it by now. But I think it was a ploy to buy time. I mean, 2 weeks before the 7th of October, on the 22nd of September 23, Netanyahu presented a map of the new Middle East, he called it, at the UN General Assembly, showing the map of Israel from the river Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. And it does not mention anything about Palestine. It made it very clear that there's only Eretz Israel or Greater Israel. So the whole Palestinian population, Palestine, or any such thing was removed from that map of how he
That
saw
was pre-October 7th, just to be clear.
October 7th.
So yeah, so that doesn't show much goodwill in terms of a two-state solution.
No.
So in any case with the two-state solution, the reason I think that I found it sort of unlikely is that the settlements. And so can you tell us a little about the settlements?
Yeah. So when after the 1967 war, when Israel expanded and took over the rest of Palestine, they started building settlements on land that did not belong to them in the West Bank and Jerusalem. So that made and they sort of kept moving more and more settlers into those lands. So that made the two-state solution almost impossible. And it is a war crime for an occupying power to transfer its civilian population into territories that it occupies. It's just a big no-no. The UN
Fourth
repeat
Geneva Convention, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So the UN
Friday.
repeatedly condemned the construction of the settlements, that they were in violation of the Geneva Convention. And to give you an example, as of January 23, like over a year ago, there were 144 illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank and 12, including 12 in East Jerusalem. And with over 750,000 settlers living illegally in occupied Palestinian lands. So that makes it very, very, very difficult to have a two-state solution. And also the International Court of Justice also said that the settlements are illegal. But Israel, unfortunately, is not being accountable and continues to build settlements to arm the settlers, to give them their own highways and roads, to put the military to protect them. And oftentimes we see settlers, and I think we're seeing it now more and more because it's become available online. So settlers rampage through Palestinian villages, setting fire to the land and to the trees, killing and injuring Palestinians, and with no consequence whatsoever. They just like are reprimanded, possibly, possibly not, and then they just carry on.
Yeah, there's absolutely no legal comeback, it feels. But going back to what you said about building roads and things like that, specifically for settlers within Palestinian land, there are 645 at the last count physical obstacles. That means like roadblocks, checkpoints, and so on, which stop Palestinians from accessing each other, from visiting their families, from going to that shop, to visiting this village, to being separated from bits of their farmland. So it just makes it really has this kind of divisive impossibility for people who are used to living on that land.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
for families in Bethlehem, and I think
Yeah.
they can take this. Yeah.
Yeah, like my family in Bethlehem. I mean, we've been there. We took the boys, my cousin Muna. We've seen the experience, but the harassment they go through on a daily basis, the checkpoints, living behind the wall. So I think it makes it untenable, even the daily lives, and by controlling the Palestinian territory, so this level, the Israelis have systematically segregated Palestinian communities into a series of enclaves because where in Palestinian culture it's very important, like many cultures, the community is very important, the closeness, the interaction. But by creating and separating them into enclaves, that made it, that affects the daily lives of Palestinians as well, including my
Yeah,
family.
South Africa did the same thing. My parents are from there, and it's a Bantustan system of
Mm,
just separating people. And it is it's done with a purpose to sort of fracture communities and families.
mhm, mhm.
And there's also a wall.
Yeah, so on top of that, there's the 700-kilometer wall, which is the Israeli barrier. It runs inside the West Bank, and most Palestinian farmers are being isolated by the barrier. Um, And even if they've taken down I can't see them taking down the wall, removing the 750,000 and growing settlers, all the checkpoints and so on. So I'm not sure that a two-state solution is even viable anymore. And Netanyahu was bragging how he's made sure that it's not going to happen on his watch and how he's derailed that from ever happening.
Yeah. Um, so the Israeli settlers, we talked about them sort of rampaging with impunity. Even Biden finally, put a censor on some of them. They don't, because they don't have to live under Palestinian law. They're living in what's nominally Palestine, but they live under Israeli civil law.
Yeah.
But the Palestinians in the same area, maybe across the street from that settlement, are living under Israeli military law. So can you give me an example of what that means?
Yeah, yeah. So there are kind of multiple rules and regulations for people. So if you're Jewish, Israeli, or Israeli, you follow civil law in Israel. The Palestinians in Israel, they also follow the civil law, but they are discriminated against, and there are laws that discriminate against them. But for the Palestinians under occupation, as you said, so let's say there's a settler here, a 12-year-old boy settler and a 12-year-old Palestinian living side by side in the West Bank. And let's say they both decide to throw stones at an Israeli authority or army in protest. So what will happen is the 12-year-old Jewish boy who's living in the settlement, legal settlement, would be arrested, taken to juvenile court with a lawyer, his parents present, and then whatever, and pardoned. But the Palestinian boy living in the same neighborhood and same village or next door village, he could be arrested at night with taken from his home, which happens all the time, without his parents, without a lawyer, and he would be taken out of the West Bank, occupied West Bank, and inside Israel, which, by the way, is a violation of international law. And then he would be interrogated, usually in Hebrew. And for older kids, they're made to sign confessions in Hebrew without even understanding what they do because of the confessions and torture, and without a lawyer being present. So, and probably that boy will have to, not probably, that boy will follow Israeli military court and not the civilian court. So it's complete discrimination, even by the court system. One is military, as you said, and one is civil.
Yeah.
And by the way,
yeah. No, go ahead.
And by the way, Israel is the only country in the world that has a military juvenile detention system for children as young as 12. No other country in the world has it. So the same territory, the same government, but everyone is being judged under a different rule, and based on the religion, based on ethnicity and nationality. So imagine if you live in I don't know, Canada, the US, the UK, and that you're a citizen, and there are different rules and regulations and different court systems that apply to you according to your skin color, your race, and your religion. I mean, how would you feel about it? And yet, I mean, this has been happening to Palestinians year after year after year. So it's quite traumatic.
Yeah, and I think what you just described is also possibly a best case scenario for the Palestinian kid, because because that there is some form of judicial process in that scenario you described, but there's also a thing called administrative detention, and 5,000 more Palestinians since October 7th. Clearly not all security threats have been put into administrative detention since then. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, very few people know about that. And actually, that's a law that was, I think, a remnant of the British colonialist empire at the time. So administrative detention means that Israel can hold and detain anyone indefinitely without trial, without having done anything wrong. And thousands of Palestinian women, children, adults, older people are held in Israeli prisons for years and without charge. And since the Israeli occupation of Palestine, we've had more than 800,000 Palestinians who have been detained, as per many human rights organizations and factual data. And oftentimes they're arrested, they're tortured. We hear about humiliation, rape cases, abuses, including women and children, and that's never talked about. And again, that's all documented by international human rights organizations for those who want to look them up. So really, they're being held against their will, without charges, and it's like a form of hostage taking, really, and abuse.
Yeah. So it's a good time to talk about apartheid, a system, because as I'm South African descent, my parents experienced firsthand having to be not in this area or be, not be able to sit on that bench because of their skin color or whatever. So apartheid sorted people according to ethnicity and skin color. And I think we all agree that it was necessary for Mandela to resist apartheid, but he was branded a terrorist. He spent 27 years in prison. And even after he was president of South Africa, from 1994 to 1999, he remained on the US terror watch list until 2008. So tell us why people, that's just a little side note there, I wanted to get that out, but tell us why people talk about Israel as having apartheid.
Yeah, no, by the way, we as Palestinians were eternally grateful to South Africa for standing with the Palestinians and for taking the case to the ICJ. I think that's really incredible. Um, uh, so, racial discrimination against Palestinians, it's not my opinion or anyone else. It's all documented from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, from B'Tselem, and so on. So it's all, it's all there. And just to kind of talk about it and to deny it is almost irrelevant because it's there, it's documented.
Yeah.
And I think it was really important that the ICJ did their historic ruling on the 18th of January 24, confirming that Israel is contravening the genocide convention that it signed, and that they're plausibly committing a genocide. And so there are many forms of genocide, and what the ICJ referred to was the killing, maiming, preventing births, starving the general population of Gaza from food and water, and many other things. So, we're seeing it live. It's not something that's fabricated, and it's really, horrific.
But why doesn't the ruling stop what's going on?
I mean, the court doesn't have any jurisdiction to force Israel to comply. Unfortunately, only the US has the leverage on Israel. And of course, international sanctions could work, and divestment. But this happened in South Africa, as we know. It worked very well to end apartheid. But the US continues to give 3.8 billion each year in military aid and financial aid to Israel, of American taxpayers' money. So I think it really suits the US to have Israel in the region, to keep the region destabilized and as a controlling force, a nuclear force, really. And it seems like Israel explicitly rejects the international law, rule of law, if you like. And we're seeing a very second big Nakba, where they're trying to displace the Palestinians, to push them into the desert, to Egypt, and so on.
Yeah,
So,
but it's not just displacing, it's reducing people's homes to rubble. It's the infrastructure, structural violence, which is, it's one thing to clear out. I mean, it's bad enough to clear out people from, say, a hospital, but then we've heard stories of then going back and actually killing the most skilled surgeons, destroying the expensive equipment. So in essence, making that hospital unusable, even if the population were to return, which looks less and less likely.
yeah, I mean, hospitals, schools, universities, mosques, churches, look, the entire infrastructure is being
Yeah.
destroyed. And they're forcing the indigenous Palestinian people to move again and to leave their homes. So they've moved them all over Gaza. They're denying people medicine, water. They're using starvation as the new level of brutality and cruelty, really. We haven't seen that to that level. You hear of famines, natural famines, but this is forced famines. So, sorry. So honestly, Western governments and leaders are not listening to their people. You see the demonstrations, you see the pro-Palestinian support. They can stop it, but they haven't been, and it's really tragic.
Yeah. What I've noticed, and I think is very heartening, is that there are significant numbers of Israelis and Jewish people all over the world who are speaking out more. And it is extremely brave, because I think there is a tendency to really put pressure on them not to critique Israel. Again, nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's just a question of a strong enough government will be able to take critiques. I'm allowed to call Rishi Sunak pretty much anything I want if I'm not, not like, or to argue against his policies. And I think that's just a normal, healthy way for a democracy to run. So let's talk about some of these voices.
Yeah.
Can you give us a couple of examples, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So breaking the silence is one of them. They are very brave ex-IDF soldiers who are speaking about the systematic way the IDF is trained to terrorize and dehumanize Palestinians. And they talk about their sort of experiences in the West Bank and Gaza and dealing and East Jerusalem, dealing with Palestinians. The Jewish Voices for Peace are also amazing, and they've been very vocal and supportive. And many other
Yeah.
Israeli.
If
Yeah.
not now.org is another one, I think.
Which one? Sorry.
If not now.
Yeah,
.org.
no.org.
There are many, and there are also a lot of Jewish and Israeli scholars and academics and journalists, such as Avi Schleim, Gabor Mate, Ilan Pape, Noam Chomsky, of course, people like Chris Hedges, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists who I would highly recommend. And
And
around
also Miko Peled as
yes,
well. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
there are many.
Yeah, and we'll and on the streets around the world, there are still protests going on many months, a few months later, and on social media and against various governments. Why do you think these protests still continue?
Yeah, I think it resonated with people. I mean, we've seen all indigenous people throughout history being crushed and systematically abused and so on. And I think with And I think when freedom and dignity is denied, and sorry, there was noise in the background. So I think when freedom and dignity is denied, and when people are humiliated, and when there's blatant abuse of the power of the occupation and human rights year after year, decade after decade, um, eventually, people are not slaves or are not going to just stay still and do nothing. So if it's I ask everybody who's watching, who's listening to this, is if it was your child or your loved one who is taken into custody as a parent, you know, charged or not charged, humiliated, tortured, don't know where they are, taken away from you. I mean, how would you truly behave? Would you just sit and let it happen, or would you do something about it or feel enraged to want to do something about it? And I think this has been happening to Palestinians for 75 years. So really, they're all those who are being held without charges are held against their will, which is held as hostage.
Yeah,
Yeah, held as hostages, really. So it's
yeah,
quite, yeah.
yeah. No,
I think
absolutely.
people are seeing it now. So that's why they're supporting Palestine and Palestinians, because now they're really seeing what's going on or what has been going on that they hadn't seen before.
Yeah, and but there is a reasoning that from Israel that they have to worry about security and safety, and but they have a very powerful army, and the Palestinians do not have an army. Certainly, you know,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they have one of the most powerful armies in the world, with access to the latest tech from America and the West, and from equipment to intelligence to latest everything. And the Palestinians aren't even allowed to have an army. They don't have a navy. They don't have an air force. So or advanced weapons. So really, I mean, there's asymmetry. Sorry.
yeah, but the bigger question is not really about symmetry, isn't it? Isn't the bigger question that Israel is the occupier and they've chosen to occupy Palestine past the boundaries assigned by the United Nations.
Yes.
But despite that, it feels like that there's a big focus on Israel being the victims. But it's very hard to square that with the reality that Israel is an occupying force. I don't think we talk about the occupied territories. I don't think there's anything controversial in that. So I think that's kind of for me the disconnect there is that the occupiers are generally not portrayed as the victims, but I think it's been the other way around for a long time now.
Yeah, I think it's really Israeli propaganda, and it has been and continues to be the focus on the Israelis being the victims. It's just I've never seen that in history where the occupier becomes the victim. And we talk about security for the Israelis, but how about security for the Palestinians who have been under occupation for all these years?
Yes, well, that's something we don't talk about at all. It's like Palestinian security is very much a non-starter in the conversation. But right now we're talking about okay, even if there's a security issue for Israel, we're talking about 14,000 children dead out of 30,000 people dead in Gaza, and the prospect of tens of thousands of more starving imminently in the coming weeks. 1.3% of the population in Gaza gone in less than 4 months.
That's right. That's right.
Give us some context around that if it was compared to the US.
Yeah. And that's without counting people under the rubble.
But
They have
just But just, yeah.
But these are the figures as of now, as of less than 4 months into this war. I think, when people say it's not a genocide, and I say, well, you have to look at the context and look at the numbers. So 1.3% of the population being murdered and killed in less than 4 months. So if you look at the US population, around 350, 335 million, and if 1.3% of Americans were killed in less than 4 months, that means 4.4 million Americans dead, killed. If you compare it to the UK, that gives you 1 million killed, or Canada, 600,000 killed in less than 4 months. So these are astronomical numbers, and they are not debatable, and they are not something that they're proven by international organizations. So it's not made up numbers. And it's just horrific, even if it's a fraction of that. But yet, despite these horrific numbers and deaths and the genocide, Western countries and continue to support the war in Gaza. They continue to provide military and financial aid to they continue to provide military and financial aid to Israel, and knowing that the majority of those deaths are children and women.
Yeah, it's not a war in the sense of here's this army and here's that army. It's carpet bombing. Of course, mostly women and children and mostly civilians. So it's hard not to conclude from this that Palestinian lives are considered cheaper, and because people seem to be consistently dehumanized to the point that their lives are cheap. Can you get security like this? Can Israel achieve its objective of security in your opinion? I mean,
Yeah. No, I just don't see how, because in the 75 years of brutal occupation and ethnic cleansing and displacement of Palestinians, Israel is still not feeling secure, nor will it in the future. Excuse me, because, by treating Palestinians like human animals, as a quote by one of the Israeli government leaders, it's not the solution. And any evolved person would know that. So really, the solution is to stop this brutal occupation and to have a different solution, because otherwise it'll just continue year on year, day on day.
And safety for Palestinians, we kind of touched on that. I'll just kind of say that, for me, if that's, of course, security for Palestinians is equally important. They are being occupied, and they can have their doors kicked in and their children or themselves taken to jail with impunity. And that's been happening every day for decades. And I think it's important to have that context when we talk about this situation. It is Palestinians who are living under occupation, under military rule. So, what about their safety and security? So
Exactly.
we know that a two-state solution is not on the table anymore. Even if it is, it would be a much reduced Palestine without true sovereignty. There's no way that's going to happen, it seems, under Netanyahu for sure. So what do you have a possible ideal solution in mind if anything could happen?
Yeah, I mean, now that they made it very clear that it's two-state, well, it's just not feasible, a two-state solution, as you said, and a reduced Palestine is not going to be feasible either. So I think, I don't see why, and that's my opinion. I think the only option remaining is one single democratic, secular state from the river to the sea, with equal democratic rights for all citizens, regardless of your religion, your ethnicity, and a system that ensures safety and security and human rights for everyone living in the state. It could be a
So for Israelis and Palestinians living in one
yeah,
state,
everyone living
one
together.
person, one vote. Yeah.
Yeah, coexisting Palestinians, Christian, Muslim, Jews, and so on. So, for example, if you look at the US today or any other country, it's unthinkable to say, well, some of you citizens can vote and have all the rights as citizens, and others are not allowed based on your ethnicity, your color, your religion. It's just unthinkable. We've moved way past that. So I don't see why in Israel we have that, and we can't move to a one-state solution. And this should be really, it should be an equal vote, and not sort of a vote that is where Jewish people or Muslims or Christians have more rights than others. And I think it could be a multi-party system expanded to include the Palestinian people. And I think, ironically, that's how things used to be, where pre-Zionism, where Palestine, or people in Palestine coexisted, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, living side by side. So this can be codified into law, into a one state, one vote that's secular and equal for all citizens.
Yeah, but Zion is very focused on a Jewish homeland, so it doesn't look like that's a likely scenario.
I don't think it's going to be something the Israelis are going to accept in a hurry, even though you have 7 million Jewish people, 7 million Palestinians, and it's, living and sharing the land, whether occupier, occupied, everyone's living there. So I think to have real safety, real security, and real prosperity for all, it's all about having equal human rights and dignity for every citizen.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Let's leave it on
But
that lovely note. And thank you very much for taking the time to listen. And please share.
Yeah, and just one more thing I wanted to say. Nelson Mandela said, from South Africa, we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. So,
Yeah.
so I think it's just reflection of human rights and dignity and values. And we've seen it happen in South Africa, where whites and blacks and everyone is sort of coexisting and living, and let's hope for that in.
Well, definitely the white population very much feared their security would be ruined if a black government came to power. And nobody's saying there's perfection. There isn't anywhere. There's racism. There are community issues everywhere in the world. But people learn to live together if they feel at least they have some equality and democracy. So that's my kumbaya moment. We'd love to
Oh,
see.
and I hope so, inshallah, as we say.
Indeed.
May that happen.
But thank you, Hanan, for that.
No, thank you, Shamim, and thank you everyone for listening. And we hope that was helpful and useful. And let us know if you want to know more. Thanks.
Okay. Bye.